Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're tackling a topic that frustrates a lot of English learners: grammar. Why does it feel so complicated? And more importantly, how can you make it easier?
Yeah, English grammar can be a nightmare if you try to memorize every rule.
But the good news is, you don't have to.
There are smarter ways to learn it without feeling overwhelmed.
Exactly. The trick is to focus on understanding grammar, not just memorizing rules. Because let's be honest, native speakers don't walk around thinking, oh, I need to use the past perfect continuous here.
Right. Most people learn grammar naturally by seeing and using it in context, but traditional learning methods make it feel like math, with a bunch of formulas to memorize.
No wonder people struggle with it.
So today, we're breaking it down. We'll talk about why grammar feels so confusing and share practical tips to simplify it. Let's get started.
All right. So let's start with the big question. Why does English grammar feel so complicated?
Well, one reason is that English has a lot of exceptions. You learn a rule, and then suddenly, you find out there are 5 different ways to break it.
Yes.
Like verb tenses, you learn simple past, I ate pizza yesterday. Easy, right?
But then you hear, I have eaten pizza before, and I was eating pizza when you called, and suddenly, you're wondering why there are so many ways to talk about the past.
Exactly. And if you try to memorize every single rule before actually using the language, it just feels impossible.
Right. But here's the thing: native speakers don't consciously think about grammar rules when they talk.
They just use them.
Yes, and that's a key point. Grammar should be learned through usage, not just memorization.
So instead of stressing over grammar textbooks, what's a better way to learn?
The best way is through input, reading, listening, and noticing patterns in real conversations. When you see grammar in context, your brain naturally picks it up.
Totally. And another tip: focus on the most common grammar structures first.
You don't need to learn every tense right away.
Start with the basics, like present simple, past simple, and future simple.
Yes, most conversations happen with just a few tenses. You can learn the complex stuff later, once you're comfortable with the basics.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes. A lot of learners hesitate to speak because they're scared of getting the grammar wrong. But making mistakes is how you improve.
Exactly. Even native speakers make grammar mistakes sometimes. The important thing is to communicate. If people understand you, that's what really matters.
And the more you use English, the more natural grammar will feel.
You won't have to stop and think, wait, should I use past perfect here?
It'll just sound right.
Yes, so instead of focusing too much on memorizing grammar rules, focus on listening, reading, and using the language. That's how grammar actually starts to make sense.
And it becomes way less stressful when you learn it this way.
Grammar should help you express yourself, not hold you back.
Exactly. Grammar should be a tool, not an obstacle. But a lot of learners get stuck because they feel like they need to know everything before they can even start speaking.
Yeah, and that's a huge mistake. You don't need perfect grammar to be understood.
In fact, most fluent speakers, especially in casual conversations, don't use textbook grammar all the time.
Right. And contractions, slang, and informal speech all change how grammar is used in real life. That's why learning only from textbooks can make your English sound stiff or unnatural.
Exactly. So instead of memorizing complex grammar rules, one thing that helps is listening to how native speakers actually talk. Watch movies, listen to podcasts, or even read comments on social media.
That's a great point. And when you do that, don't just listen passively. Try to notice how sentences are structured. Pay attention to patterns, like how people use tenses or prepositions naturally.
Yes, and if you see a phrase that confuses you, don't just move on. Write it down, look it up, and try to use it in your own sentences. That's how you start internalizing grammar instead of just memorizing it.
And another trick: if you're unsure about a grammar rule, search for real examples instead of just reading a definition. If you Google present perfect examples, you'll see how it's used in real sentences.
That's way more helpful than just reading an explanation.
Definitely. And one more thing: don't get obsessed with why certain grammar rules exist. English has so many weird rules that don't make logical sense. Instead of overthinking them, just accept that this is how the language works.
Yes.
Like, why do we say, I went home, instead of, I went to home?
It doesn't really follow a clear pattern, it's just how English works.
Exactly. Some things you just have to accept and move on. The more exposure you get to real English, the more these things will start to feel natural.
And that's really the goal, learning grammar in a way that makes it feel natural, instead of like a set of complicated rules you have to memorize.
Right, the more you use English, the less you'll have to think about grammar. It'll just become second nature over time.
And that's why immersion is so important.
You don't need to live in an English-speaking country to get that experience. You just need to surround yourself with English as much as possible.
Exactly. Make English a part of your daily life. Change your phone settings to English, watch YouTube videos, listen to music with lyrics, and even think in English. The more you expose yourself to the language, the more naturally grammar will come to you.
Yeah. And when you start thinking in English, you stop translating everything from your native language.
That's a big reason why grammar feels difficult. People try to apply their own language rules to English, and it doesn't always work.
That's so true. English sentence structure is different from many other languages. If you translate word for word, the grammar often sounds unnatural.
Right.
That's why one of the best ways to improve is to learn grammar in chunks. Instead of studying individual words, pay attention to phrases.
Yes, for example, instead of just learning the word entrusted, learn the phrase I'm interested in. That way, you automatically learn the correct preposition that goes with it.
Exactly.
This helps you avoid common grammar mistakes without needing to memorize long lists of rules.
Another way to simplify grammar is to practice with real conversations. Even if you don't have a speaking partner, you can practice by speaking to yourself.
Yes. Self-talk is such an underrated learning method. Just describe what you're doing, like, I am making coffee, or I will go to work soon. It helps you practice grammar without overthinking it.
And if you're not comfortable speaking yet, even writing short sentences every day helps. You don't have to write essays, just a simple journal entry like today was a busy day. I went to the store and bought some food.
That's a great idea.
Writing forces you to think about sentence structure, but without the pressure of real-time conversation. Plus, you can go back and correct your mistakes.
Yes, and if you want extra practice, you can even use apps like Grammarly to check your writing and learn from your errors.
That's a great way to get feedback.
But at the end of the day, don't get too obsessed with fixing every small mistake.
The goal is to be understood, not to be perfect.
Exactly. And as long as you keep exposing yourself to English and using it regularly, grammar will start making sense naturally. You don't have to learn everything at once, just take it step by step.
Yeah. And the more you focus on communication rather than perfection, the faster you'll improve. Grammar is important, but it shouldn't hold you back from actually using the language.
That's a key point. Grammar should help you, not stop you from speaking. Some learners get so worried about making mistakes that they never actually use the language.
Yeah, and that's the biggest reason people feel stuck. They spend years studying grammar, but still struggle to hold a conversation because they've never really practiced using it naturally.
Exactly. Think about how kids learn a language. They don't start by memorizing grammar rules, they just listen, copy, and use what they hear. And over time, their grammar improves automatically.
That's a great comparison. And it's proof that grammar isn't something you have to master before speaking. It develops as you use the language more.
Yes, so instead of waiting until you feel ready, start using English now. Even if your grammar isn't perfect, you'll improve way faster than someone who only studies but never speaks.
Right.
And if you ever feel stuck, remember that even native speakers break grammar rules all the time in casual speech.
What really matters is being understood.
Absolutely. The goal is fluency, not perfection. If you're able to communicate and people understand you, then you're already using grammar well enough.
Exactly.
And the more you speak, listen, and expose yourself to real English, the more natural grammar will feel.
It's all about practice and consistency.
Yes, so instead of stressing about every rule, focus on real communication. That's the best way to simplify grammar and make learning English so much easier.
And speaking of making things easier, another great way to absorb grammar naturally is by shadowing.
Oh, absolutely. For anyone who doesn't know, shadowing is when you listen to a native speaker and repeat what they say immediately, copying their pronunciation, intonation, and sentence structure.
Exactly. And the cool thing is, it forces you to use correct grammar without even thinking about it. You are not analyzing the rules, you're just mimicking how English is actually spoken.
Right. And when you do that consistently, you start recognizing patterns without needing to memorize them. It's like training your brain to feel what sounds right.
Yeah, and it helps with fluency too.
The more you shadow, the more comfortable you get forming sentences naturally, without pausing to translate or think about grammar rules.
And it's such an easy thing to do. You can shadow podcasts, TV shows, YouTube videos, anything where you hear natural English being spoken.
Yep.
And if you find grammar confusing in writing, sometimes hearing it used correctly in conversation makes it click.
A lot of grammar makes more sense when you hear it rather than just reading about it in a textbook.
So true. That's why I always recommend listening to real-life English as much as possible. Even if you don't understand everything at first, your brain is still absorbing the patterns.
Exactly. And another thing that really helps is using grammar in real situations. Like instead of just doing exercises in a book, actually write a message, speak to someone, or record yourself talking about your day.
Yes, the more you use grammar in a meaningful way, the better you'll remember it. Just doing worksheets isn't enough. You need to apply what you learn in real-life situations.
Right. And don't be afraid to experiment with new grammar structures. If you learn a new tense, try using it in a sentence that describes your own life. That way, it sticks better because it's personal to you.
That's a great tip. The more personal the learning experience, the easier it is to remember. If you just read about grammar rules without making them relevant to your life, they won't stick as well.
Exactly. So instead of just memorizing if clauses, actually write sentences like, if I wake up early, I will go for a run. It makes grammar feel useful instead of just something abstract.
And that's really the key, making grammar practical, natural, and something you use every day. The more you integrate it into your life, the less complicated it feels.
And once you start using grammar naturally, you'll realize that a lot of the complicated rules aren't even necessary to focus on in the beginning.
Exactly. Some learners worrying about advanced structures before they even master the basics. But honestly, most conversations use simple grammar. If you can use present, past, and future tenses correctly, you can communicate in almost any situation.
That's a great point. Instead of stressing about advanced grammar like the past perfect, continuous, or conditionals, focus on the most commonly used structures first. Get comfortable with them, and then add more complexity over time.
Yes, and even native speakers don't use advanced grammar all the time. When we speak, we naturally simplify things. That's why learning conversational grammar, what people actually use, is more important than mastering every rule.
Absolutely.
And another thing, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Some people hesitate to speak because they're worried about grammar errors. But honestly, mistakes are part of the learning process.
100%. Think about how kids learn a language. They make mistakes all the time, but they still keep talking. And eventually, their grammar improves because they keep using the language.
Exactly. The best way to learn is to use English, even if you're unsure. If you wait until your grammar is perfect, you'll never start speaking.
Right, and funny enough, most native speakers won't even notice small grammar mistakes in conversation. As long as your meaning is clear, that's what really matters.
And even if someone does correct you, that's actually a good thing.
It means you're learning and improving. Every mistake is a lesson.
Absolutely. Instead of feeling embarrassed, think of mistakes as stepping stones to fluency. The more you make, the faster you learn.
Yep. So, bottom line, don't overcomplicate grammar. Use it, make mistakes, learn from them, and keep going.
That's how real progress happens.
Exactly. The goal isn't to be a grammar expert, the goal is to communicate. And the more you focus on using English, the more naturally grammar will come to you.
And once you develop that mindset where grammar is just a tool for communication instead of something you have to master before speaking, you'll feel so much more confident using English.
Exactly. Confidence is a huge part of language learning. A lot of people actually know more grammar than they think, but they hesitate because they're afraid of getting it wrong.
Right. But the truth is, confidence comes from practice, not from knowing every rule perfectly. The more you speak and use English, the more natural it will feel.
That's why it's so important to just start using English as much as possible. Even if you only know basic grammar, use it. The more you practice, the more comfortable you get.
Yes.
And something that really helps is finding ways to make English part of your daily routine.
Even small habits like reading an article in English every morning or talking to yourself while cooking can make a big difference.
Totally. Learning grammar in a classroom is one thing, But actually living in the language, even if you're not in an English-speaking country, is what really helps you improve.
And that's what separates the people who improve quickly from those who feel stuck.
The ones who improve the fastest are the ones who use English daily, not just study it.
Yep, and the best part is, once you get into the habit of using English regularly, grammar stops feeling like something you have to study. It just becomes part of how you naturally communicate.
Exactly. And that's when things really start to click. Grammar starts making sense because you're experiencing it in real situations, not just reading about it in a book.
Right. So instead of memorizing a bunch of grammar rules you might never use, focus on real English the way people actually speak and write. That's how you make grammar feel simple and natural.
And when you focus on real English, you start noticing patterns naturally.
You won't have to think, wait, is this the past perfect or just the past simple?
Your brain will just know what sounds right.
Exactly. That's why exposure is so important. If you're constantly listening to English, reading in English, and using it in real situations, grammar becomes instinctive.
Right. And a good trick is to listen to the same phrases over and over again. If you hear native speakers using a certain structure, try to repeat it in your own conversations.
That's a great tip. It's kind of like how we learn song lyrics. We don't memorize them word by word. We just hear them so often that we start singing along without even realizing it.
Yes.
And you can do the same thing with English.
If you hear a phrase like, "I've been meaning to call you," you don't need to break down the grammar, you just start using it because you've heard it enough times.
Exactly. And this is where having a language input habit is super helpful. If you make it a habit to surround yourself with natural English every day, you'll pick up grammar without even trying.
Right. And the best part is, this works for every level. Even if you're just starting out, you can still train your brain by listening and repeating simple sentences.
Yes, and if you're more advanced, you can refine your grammar by paying attention to small details in native speech, like contractions, word order, or natural phrasing.
Absolutely.
So, instead of thinking of grammar as this huge, complicated thing you have to study, think of it as something you absorb by interacting with real English.
That shift in mindset makes learning so much easier. The more you expose yourself to real English, the more everything grammar, pronunciation, vocabulary just starts to fall into place naturally.
Exactly.
It's about using the language, not just memorizing rules.
The more you use English in your daily life, the more natural it becomes.
And that's really the key takeaway. Grammar isn't something you need to master before you start speaking. It's something that develops naturally when you use English every day.
Exactly.
So instead of worrying about every little rule, focus on exposure and practice. The more you interact with real English, the easier grammar will feel.
And don't forget, mistakes are part of the process. Every time you use English, even with errors, you're learning and improving.
Absolutely.
So, whether you're listening to podcasts, watching movies, or having conversations, just keep using English.
The more you use it, the more natural it becomes.
That's the best way to simplify grammar, by making it a tool for communication instead of something that holds you back.
Exactly.
So go out there, practice, and don't let grammar stop you from speaking.
You've got this.
That's it for today's episode. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, keep practicing, keep improving, and we'll catch you in the next one.
Bye.
Bye.